Dave, and hello to everyone. Thanks also to Dave Bell and the team for organising this series of webinars. So just let me start us off by giving you a couple of personal reflections. So they're going to be incomplete, and they're by way of opening up a discussion really, and reflecting that whilst we've got some specific policy and some frameworks around safeguarding, and you'll be hearing soon from colleagues who've helped us develop those, still safeguarding I think is relatively young as an area of administration and practice in research, and something that we need to keep an eye on in our work together, and I guess in other projects as well. So just a couple of thoughts to give that some texture. First of all, that my own coming to safeguarding, if you like, is through research ethics. So as a social scientist, I deploy research ethics every time I collect data. I go through research ethics procedures. I appreciate that ethics may be more or less familiar to different traditions of science, but certainly I guess we would all appreciate that research ethics has accumulated a set of principles that govern how researchers should carry out their research. So these include our relationship with respondents and their voices, how we represent the voices of respondents, as well as how we interact with them. Also the ecologies and the environments in which we work. So that ethics does have this long history, a large literature, it has formal training, it has agreed norms of behavior. And importantly, I think when compared to safeguarding, it has clear boundaries of responsibility. Now, safeguarding has elements of all of this, but what exactly they are, I think, is still a little bit unclear. If you like, we're applying safeguarding in real time. And again, colleagues on this call may disagree, and that would be great to get other people's views who are more steeped in safeguarding than I am. So I think the current hub understanding is that safeguarding addresses people's right to be safe from harm, and that's relating to any activity associated with the hub. If you like, ethics then can be a subset of safeguarding. It's the piece of professional work that we do thinking about others and our power relations during the research application, but safeguarding extends from that into all our social relations, respondents when we're not undertaking research, colleagues that we work with, possibly even the general public. So you can begin to see, I think, the range of questions and the difficulty of applying safeguarding. Just give you four of them. The first I've sort of indicated. So who are we interested in with safeguarding? Is it colleagues? Is it the respondents? Is it the general public, all or a subset? What is the subject of safeguarding? Safeguarding came from concerns around sexual exploitation between those receiving food aid and humanitarians. So is safeguarding about sexual exploitation? Is it about the exploitation of other things like intellectual property or time, if a senior researcher leans on a junior researcher, forcing them to work beyond what would be reasonable, or are there other things indeed? So what is it that is the focus of safeguarding? How do we define behavior across any of these who's and what's to be appropriate or inappropriate across at least 5 different cultural contexts, and recognizing within the countries, the 5 countries, primary countries in the hub, there will be other sort of multiple cultural norms. And then, of course, how do we administer? No? How do we monitor, report, act? What sorts of sanctions would be reasonable? And how do we determine the appropriateness of a sanction for a certain sort of act? So those are huge questions, which I'm very glad we've got some serious expertise to help us answer. But in essence, this is a collective journey. So I'd like to think that all of our views are important in resolving as best we can what safeguarding will be for us in the hub. With that then, I'll say thanks, and that I'm looking forward to the discussion, and hand everybody on to Dave Lyons. Or Dave Bell. I'm not sure.
Dave Bell.
Sorry, Dave Bell.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, hi everyone. For those that don't know me, I'm the monitoring and knowledge exchange specialist. So I do a lot of work on the reporting side of our Tomorrow Cities, but I've also been leading on developing our safeguarding policy. So these 3 webinars that we have over the next 3 weeks are our way of trying to start conversations, open up conversations across the hub on these tricky ethical issues that we're having to deal with, and positioning safeguarding within kind of a conversation around ethics, because it's so closely related, but importantly different as well. With us today to help these kind of broad discussions that we're starting with, which we framed around, we're trying to create impact. We're an impact-focused research program, but of course there is a dark side to impact as well. It can be both positive and negative. So how do we ensure that our impact is positive, and how do we mitigate any potential for negative impact? To help us think through and discuss this today, we've got Richard Powell, who's an independent safeguarding consultant, who's got a lot of experience in the NGO sector. And then we also have Sam Stadden and Clara Callier, who are both researchers from Edinburgh University, who are very experienced in working in and around global research ethics. The 3 of them have been helping me develop the safeguarding policy and think through this engagement. So just to further, well, actually one important notice I should give, and we're going to be communicating across the hub, but we now have our safeguarding policy agreed by the executive committee. Hopefully you can all see my screen okay. So this is now online, available to download and read. One bit they'll emphasize is that a key mechanism in how we're applying safeguarding, the practicalities, is reporting concerns. So if you do have any concerns of any type, and you don't have to worry about this is technically ethical or safeguarding related, there's nothing too small to report. If you have any concerns at all, then 2 initial points of contact are Eliane, the operations manager, who I'm sure you all know, or myself. Our emails are here, or you can use this online form, which allows you to report anonymously or not, but also to choose who you're going to be sending this to, including an external contact, in case you don't feel comfortable or any of the issues you want to report involve Eliane or myself or anyone else that we work closely with. So just to start, I need to figure out how I share this now. Aha, sorry. So just to kind of pick up from the sort of definitions that Mark was giving, this is how we've come to understand ethics and safeguarding, which we've applied through the policy. It's a living document. We're looking to expand or refine or change these definitions as appropriate through these conversations. But broadly speaking, ethics or research ethics are the principles that govern how researchers should carry about their research. So it concerns doing what is right. Safeguarding specifically addresses people's right to be safe from harm relating to any activity associated with the hub. So for me, I think about this in terms of perhaps the difference between ethical research and research ethics. Conceptually, to do ethical research, we need to consider people's right to be safe from harm, but there are broader considerations as well. In practice, the procedures and the framework and the systems that we have mean that research ethics only touch upon a small part of the potential to cause harm. So typically concerned with the methodologies and the engagement with research subjects, whereas our activities expand beyond this. And so there is greater potential for harm than can be dealt with through the research ethics systems. So safeguarding is trying to address any systemic gaps or limit in scope around protecting people from harm. I should say these 3 webinars are leading up to an engagement that we're going to have. We're going to have city-based workshops with each one of the cities, and hopefully a very good representation from each of the city teams to look at safeguarding in detail, in context, What are the specific risks for your context in your research, the mitigation measures, the resources, and what are the implications for how we then refine our governance and our reporting procedures and how we address these. So we're going to start now with a bit of kicking off the conversation. Everyone is hopefully familiar with Mentimeter. If you could go to menti.com and use the code 4333323, it's at the top of the screen here. We've got some 2 initial questions for you. You'll see the questions once you log on, and you can log on through any device, your computer, iPad, phone. So there's 2 parts to this question. One is thinking about your specific work in the hub, whether that's research or managerial or otherwise. And secondly, thinking about the hub's mission as a whole. Why are we all here working together? And we want to start thinking about, well, the questions are, how much do you think about ethics in relation to your work or the hub's mission? And how relevant do you think ethics are for your work and the hub's mission? And I'll just give a few minutes for people to start to answer these questions. Hadn't realized before, but I think this gives you an aggregate number. It's not showing all the individual responses, which would have been interesting to see. So interestingly, you can see the, here we go. So now we can see the disaggregated data, which shows a bit of a broader distribution. Clearly, there's more consensus on the relevance of research of ethics to people's specific work. If we look at for the hub's mission, there's less spread in the data, which is interesting. So this is something that perhaps the panelists will have some sort of reflections on when we come to the Q&A session at the end. And perhaps we can come back to this slide to have a look at it. But I think there's some interesting comments to be had on the difference between these 2 answers. So moving on, we're going to have some discussions now. What I'm going to do is put everyone into a breakout room with 2 other people, so 3 in total. And just for 5 minutes, it's a intentionally slightly provocative question, which is, can you come up with any examples of work that we undertake as part of Tomorrow's Cities, which we don't need to consider as an ethical issue? So what is any work that we undertake that is not an ethical issue within the hub? So I'll give you a few minutes, just a minute or so to think about that as I set up the breakout rooms. We're not going to discuss this afterwards, but just to invite you to provide your answers if you have any good examples of non-ethical issues in the work that we do. If you just type this into the chat afterwards when I call you back. So I'm going to randomly select you into a breakout room. If you're not comfortable having this conversation, then don't feel bad about pulling out of the breakout room and just waiting for everyone to come back. Okay, I've started closing the rooms. We'll have people joining us back into the main room over the next 30 seconds or so. If you've just come out of a room, if you had any ideas, any thoughts on non-ethical issues in our work, please feel free to share them in the chat. Welcome back, everyone. Hopefully you had some interesting discussions. Please feel free to share your responses from your discussions, any ideas you had on non-ethical issues in the work that we do. We have one so far from Richard's group. The answer was no, which is nice and succinct. Given the time, I'd like to extend schedule to make sure we reserve our time for the speakers' presentations and discussions. So please continue to add any ideas into the chat if you could identify any non-ethical issues. Otherwise, now I'm going to hand over to Clara and Sam for their presentation. I'll just make sure I've got their presentation up on the screen.
I can share screen as well if you want, Dave.
Oh, perhaps that's easier, so then I'm not having to change the slides for you.
Okay.
Great. Over to you then, Sam and Clara.
Thank you.
Is that working? Can you see that?
No.
No. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, now I can't see anybody because I can only see my slides, which is always weird. But hi, so I'm Sam Stadden, and I'll let Clara introduce herself in just a second. But thanks, Dave, and thanks for asking us to come along. It's really nice, just even then, to have a couple of minutes to hear from people actually in the hub. So, as Dave said, Clara and I are both here at Edinburgh. I'm a lecturer in environment and development here at the School of Geosciences. And I'm chair of the ethics committee here within the School of Geosciences, who ultimately have responsibility for the ethics of the hub. So it's really nice to get to talk to you all directly. Clara?
Hi, nice to meet all of you, although, you know, I was able to see only a few faces, but it was already lovely to just be in the small group. Thanks for inviting us. And both me and Sam, we hope that, you know, like our presentation is going to open an interesting discussion. And we also offer to have other sessions in case you might be interested. So I'm a lecturer in clinical psychology, but of course I'm here not to talk about psychology, but to talk about ethics, because like Sam, I'm the chair of ethics in the School of Health and Social Science at the University of Edinburgh. And one of the reasons that me and Sam, we are here is because we are working together in a project, ethics in a global context. So we are developing a toolkit for researchers from all around the world.
Brilliant, thanks, Clara. Okay, I'm going to show a couple of slides now and talk for a bit, and then we'll hear from Clara again after that. Is that okay, Clara?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. So we've just got 5 minutes, and we've probably already had one of those minutes. So we just have a few slides just to kind of maybe start thinking about the issues involved. And I guess particularly as chair of the ethics committee within geosciences, I would just highlight that actually, you know, all of our discussion about ethics, this is a legal obligation that we have from working within the UK university system. So the Concordant to Support Research Integrity is something from the Universities UK, and we have to do this. We have to think about ethics in all of the work that we do. They set down in the Concordant 4 different issues that as researchers we're all responsible for. So honesty, rigor, transparency and open communication, and care and respect. And I guess, you know, we're all from different disciplines and working in different fields and working in different ways. And I think honesty and rigor and transparency within our science and the work that we do, the research that we do, means different things to each of us, I think, depending on the discipline. So there's, you know, discipline-specific ideas around that. And you'll all be best placed to know what are the, you know, what are the ethical ways to conduct your research in your particular discipline. But I think the fourth element there about care and respect is something that connects people across all disciplines and across all of the work that we do. So then, just to say that those kind of ethical obligations that we have are typically administered through these formal ethics procedures. So the research ethics that Dave spoke about earlier. And this is typically done through for example, through a form such as this, which it kind of makes it seem all quite easy. It makes it seem like you can just fill in the boxes that are there. You can tick the, the options that are appropriate for you, and then somehow it's done. But I think we all know that that's something very different in practice. So actually some of my work is in Nepal. I did my PhD in Nepal. And so this is a picture from a fairly recent time when I was staying in Kathmandu, to just sort of highlight, I guess for you guys working on Tomorrow's City and disaster within an urban setting and urban risk, that when you're confronted with the reality of what you're engaging with and your mission as a hub, it's something much more messy, and it's something that's very hard to get into that form. And I think, there's a real divide between the ethics procedures that we have and then actually how we go into this in practice and how we deal with it in practice, which I'm assuming is why, hopefully you all here, you're interested in thinking through those complexities and how it can be practiced in a more ethical way, I guess. So in terms of that practicing ethical work, ethical research, how do we actually go about doing that in practice rather than just the forms? I'm just pouring on work, a book here I've referenced at the bottom by Jenny Lunn about fieldwork in the Global South and ethical challenges and dilemmas. And she talks about in the introductory chapter to this book, how practicing ethical research, we can focus on 3 different things. And I think we've only got a few minutes, so I just wanted to highlight these 3 things. So one is that research is ethics integral to all aspects of research. And I think we've already established that from your results in the Menti questions that Dave asked you there. Clara's going to talk about that a little bit on the next slide. But then I wanted to highlight that the other aspect of practicing ethical research is recognizing that it is something that's very individual. So we all experience ethics differently, and that depends on who we are. It depends on our disciplinary training. It depends where we've been brought up. There's no right or wrong for any of this. There's no neutral, so-called objective view on what we're doing. And I think one of the things that it's important to do when practicing ethical research is to think about worldviews of others and paying attention to them. So, for example, I come to Nepal fairly regularly, and my perspective on looking at disaster with an urban context would be quite different possibly to somebody else's from a different discipline, or somebody that's never been there before, in the same ways it would be if I went to Quito for the first time, for example. But then we have to recognize that we all experience ethics individually, but that actually the way to share and learn and to deal with the ethical challenges that might arise in our work is to share our stories and to share our reflections. And that's really the best way forwards. Clara?
Thanks, Sam. As you can see, we decided to show you these slides that basically represent more or less the work that me and Sam and the rest of the team is doing around ethics in a complex context. So what we realized, this is the summary of a work that has been, they started more than 1 year ago, and included more or less 200 researchers from all around the world and from different disciplines and different institutions, because we wanted to be global and inclusive as much as we can. What we know that when we do our research project in a complex context, most of the time we work with a multidisciplinary team, and different countries and disciplines are involved in this conversation. And this might create a different kind of approach or different vision about what is ethics. One of the reasons that I introduced myself as a psychologist, but here I'm going to talk about ethics, because ethics can have a different kind of language or orientation according to the discipline that we are working with. What is this slide? This slide basically try to represent the idea that a research project is more or less done in different kind of steps and pathways, and have different kind of important steps. So what we would like to share with you is the idea that ethics is not only a specific moment of your research project. It's not only an application that you submit, you receive the approval, and you can run your project. ethics is how we perceive our projects. So starting from the research idea until, you know, the legacy. So what we left when we finish our project is applying the same way also when we analyze the data that we collect. Who is going to analyze the data? Are all the partners involved? Who is the main voice? The same when we publish the data. So there are ethical question, implication, and challenges in all the different steps of our research journey. And to help us to understand which are the challenges, but also which are the solutions, most of the time we can find them in the same kind of place. And as you can see, and the two different places of the slides, there are place, people, principle, and precedent, because we identify these are the key aspects that can help us to identify the ethical challenges, but is also where we can find the ethical solution. One of the paradigm shifts that we try to push is that ethics indeed is not a specific moment, but is through around the research journey. It's not a way to judge our work, our methods, our approach, but is to support conversation, facilitate conversation. And so Sam and I are here today exactly for this reason, because we hope that we can start a conversation with you, and you will be one of the promoter of conversation in your own hubs, in your own team.
Thanks, Clara. So just two very quick final slides. Dave asked us to maybe think and be provocative, and ask questions. And I think, just as Clara said, they're really what we're interested in provoking here, is to hear from you and your own individual perceptions of ethics and the ethical challenges within your work and within the hub's work more broadly, and to ask you about what conversations and resources that we can share with you to help negotiate the challenges. I think there's typically no easy answers here, but we can certainly share resources and ideas and be part of that conversation if you're interested. And I think Dave's going to share some resources with you afterwards as well, but this is just an example that was shared to me by one of my research colleagues in Nepal, which is a really great short resource. It's only a few pages, very provocative, and it just asks some really interesting questions, for example, about whose worldview has framed your research, etc. And don't underestimate the little things, I think is a really nice way of thinking about how we put this in place and practice things on a daily basis. So that's
Great.
Dave.
Thank you very much, Sam and Clara. Really interesting overview. I think there's so much more we can go into this. It's a kind of endless topic, but that was a really nice overview. Richard, do you want to say a few words about safeguarding now?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for that, Sam and Clara. That was really interesting. I'm just going to share my screen, Dave. I've got a PowerPoint. It's really short. And I'll do that. Okay, can people see that now? Dave, can you see that?
Yep, looks good, thanks.
Okay, lovely. Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Powell. My background is in international safeguarding, initially international child safeguarding, within the NGO sector, so within the humanitarian and international development context. I worked for some of the large INGOs like Oxfam and Save the Children. But I'm now working as a consultant on broader aspects of safeguarding. So Dave asked me to do a brief overview of some of the challenges in respect of safeguarding in terms of global research. So just a couple of thoughts from me. First of all, to say that obviously safeguarding issues are very closely related. There are differences to research ethics, and a lot of the context and conversations that Clara and Sam were having could apply equally with safeguarding. But safeguarding as a discipline in itself has had a lot more exposure recently because of well-publicized cases within international development and humanitarian work where safeguarding has failed. And so there's been if this isn't a contradiction, there's been an increased focus, but also a wider scope given to what we mean by safeguarding and the responsibilities that go with it. When we boil it down, nowadays, safeguarding is seen very much as the duty of care, a duty of care that when we engage with anybody, whether it's directly, it now includes people within our organization. So things like harassment in the workplace or harassment within your team is now considered a safeguarding issue. But also within the way in which the organization or agencies interacts with the people it's trying to engage with. So the background is very much of sexual exploitation, where aid workers were seen trying to obtain sexual favors in return for aid. So fundamentally, what we have in safeguarding is an issue of power, how it's used and abused, and the sort of expressions of that would be in types of harassment, exploitation, and abuse. And of course, within tomorrow's cities, what we've got is safeguarding operating within very wide range of cultural contexts and safeguarding environments. So the sort of safeguarding environment, the cultural context of one part of tomorrow's cities is very different to the other. And of course, from time to time, this does present significant dilemmas and challenges for Tomorrow City. For one example, it could well be that the sort of standards that are expected to be applied by our donors coming from a particular context, a particular safeguarding environment, those standards, the challenge might be is if you're trying to apply those standards within a context where some of the practices may well be culturally widely practiced or culturally widely accepted, there is then a tension, and that applies within the research environment just as much as it does within the INGO and humanitarian context. So, oops, sorry, I wanted to go back there. So the way I tend to look at safeguarding is looking down the telescope of risks. And I tend to start off with risks, and there is a tendency to think specifically of safeguarding is just around people's behavior, because it is so linked in with power issues and the abuse of power. But also maybe another way of looking at how safeguarding can be successful or can fail is in our systems. So what are our systems, for example, within recruitment, within human resources, within reporting systems? So that's another way that I tend to look at it. But also really interested in what we've just seen with Sam and Clara about the research journey. So for me, it's the critical issue is that when we design a program activity, we see, just as we've seen those threads in research, there is a safeguarding thread that goes through the work as well. So I was really interested in seeing the way that was expressed, that it's a continual, integral process that goes through the activity of the program. And then a particular challenge around risks is in a project like this, where there are so many different partners, there are real challenges and tensions around a very simple example, exactly what I've just said now about the tension between standards and practice. And so if you looked at risks, Very quickly, then another way of looking at safeguarding is our responsibilities. And our responsibility is to be proactive, to have a proactive and a principled focus to our work. The proactivity means that we, in our program design, we need to build in awareness and prevention measures and mitigation measures. We have to establish systems that are robust and will be able to report and respond appropriately when concerns arise. But also there is a real responsibility on us in terms of learning from our experiences. For example, one of the big challenges facing the international sector at the moment is safeguarding within COVID context, where the vulnerabilities are increased, the resources are decreased and are diverted, and the systems that were there, in part at least, to prevent safeguarding breaches are being diverted. So it's almost a perfect storm. But also learning from your experiences, from these many different contexts within Tomorrow City, there is a huge amount of experience which will make it relevant and appropriate. And then finally, some of the roles. There is a role for everybody within safeguarding, just as in ethics. Everybody has a responsibility to attain those sort of safeguarding approaches. We do that as individuals. The guidance from research councils is that there need to be identified roles, and each role has a part to play. A key role in all of this is a focal point, a person to whom concerns can be reported. Dave mentioned earlier, Elian and himself are key focal points for you if you have a concern. But you know, the overall organizations and the overall governance have a really important role to play as well. So I'm sorry if that's a little bit rushed, but that's in a nutshell how I see some of the safeguarding challenges as we face them within Tomorrow's Cities.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Really good overview of the ideas that we're grappling with in that, but also the specific challenges of putting that into practice. And a lot of the key bits of architecture that we need to implement, for example, the focal points and really identifying who the individuals are with what responsibility. This is going to come through our engagement over the next couple of weeks, but also with the city teams themselves as well. So we've got just over 10 minutes. What I'd like to do now is go into the panel discussion. And so I'd invite all the panelists, Mark included, to switch on your videos. For anyone else who's not a panelist, to switch off your video, if that's okay. And whilst the panelists are having a discussion, I've just set up a new Menti question. So I'm going to ask the panelists to answer this question in as succinctly as they can. Just pick one of the major challenges that you think that we face as Tomorrow Cities, a global research program aimed at developing impact. What is one major ethical challenge that we face? And if someone steals your challenge, you have to think of a new one as we go through. In the meantime, please, everyone else, add your own comments on what you think the major ethical challenges are we face using the Menti code 4333323. I'm not going to keep this up on display so we can focus on what the presenters are saying, but we can come back to this. Also, any of your comments and questions here, we're going to capture, and this is learning for us to feed into the subsequent webinars that we're going to have and into the city presentations, the city workshops as well. So nothing will be lost. But yes, invite you to go onto Menti now and use that code. I'll cut and paste that code into the chat. So looking at my screen, Sam, you're furthest on the left. Do you want to tell us what you think a major ethical challenge we face is?
I guess one to me would seem to be just the diversity of people within the hub and the diversity of disciplines and being able to think across those disciplines. So I think that's a challenge because, you know, like Mark said at the beginning, you know, others may disagree with his understanding of ethics or of safeguarding, and I think that's quite right because it's individual perceptions. So I think everybody within the hub will have a different perspective on it. So I guess that's a challenge across the breadth and the diversity that you have, but it should also be the strength as well, because then it's about having those conversations between each other to think through and just to open up the conversation, have, you know, and share ideas and how people have done this. Everybody's been working, I'm sure, in different contexts in different countries and can share past experience to think about some of the challenges.
Great, thanks, Sam. So the diversity of perspectives and the ambiguities of trying to come to a shared understanding is what I take from that. Clara, what are your thoughts?
Just to reiterate the diversity could be also in terms of policy. Each university, each hubs can have different policies. So how you are going to consider the difference in terms of different policies. And at the same time, another ethical challenge that I was mentioning before, most of the time we apply for ethics once and we thought that we are okay with ethics, we don't need to think about it anymore. While the big challenge in a big project like this is to think through and to have like a follow-up. Maybe like this is a discussion that we need to have like maybe every year, or or every time that there are new ethical challenges that arise. So there are these two key points that just to be quick.
Great, thanks, Clara. I'll quickly pass on then as well. Richard, safeguarding as part of a broader ethical challenge, conceptually, what do you think a major challenge we face is?
I think it's rather similar to what we've just heard, really. It is this issue of the diversity. The programme is operating in such a diverse set of context where what is a safeguarding concern in one place is not necessarily going to become a safeguarding concern in another place, whilst at the same time the whole program is being held to account on certain standards. So there's a real dilemma there, and really it highlights the need to really understand the safeguarding environment, the safeguarding context that we work in, because the legal and judicial systems, the sort of community response systems, the response to safeguarding issues can vary so much from place to place, where if one size fits all system is applied, that could actually have some serious unintended consequences in a local situation. So within an umbrella approach, which is very principled, is trying to apply international standards, there needs to be that understanding and that contextual flexibility that doesn't lead us down the path of unintended consequences.
Thanks, Richard. So we've got 3 answers in and around diversity of perspectives and how we treat that, what our approach is to it. Mark, I think I might actually put you on the spot here, and instead of ask for your major ethical concern, ask as co-director, what do you think we are doing about dealing with these different diversities of perspectives, and what do you think we could do more about them?
So thanks for that, Dave. I think I might begin by saying perhaps there's less diversity than you might think of at first glance. So I think all of us work to a fairly well-established set of professional norms, and most of us have gone through a fairly similar process of academic training as PhD students within reasonably similar institutions, with a, let's say, at some point, a European orientation towards rights. Now, that could be thought of as neo-colonial, and there's a debate to be had there. But in terms of diversity within the research community, certainly those who have a PhD and beyond, I think there's probably a reasonable amount of common ground as for what is professional, respectful behavior. Now, that's not to say there might not be individuals who circumvene that, but I think we've got actually quite a reasonable basis for agreement. What I find more challenging, and I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but there's the very hierarchical nature of academia. So whilst we talk a lot about ethics and egalitarianism and so on, actually our career structure is based very much on superiors thinking well of us, whether that's senior researchers, you know, kind of allocating the most exciting research tasks or being involved in who's publishing on a paper or not. And that's mirrored in the structure, of course, of the hub as well, with the two co-directors and then city leads, work package leads and researchers. So there's actually, I think, what we probably have a broad set of at least superficial understandings of what good behavior is. But I think the challenge is that there's all sorts of ways in which this hierarchy of power enables probably often inadvertent exploitation or a set of norms to coalesce that could be thought of by an outsider to be exploitative, particularly, as I said, around time, perhaps publishing rights, intellectual property, and of course, in its worst cases, personal relationships and sexual exploitation as well. I think that hierarchical nature of academia also puts pressures on junior staff, if you like, to self-harm, that there's pressure to work beyond the normal expected hours, you know, to put lots of time in order to publish, to please your supervisors and superiors and so on. So I think there's to me, that is perhaps one of the biggest challenges for us. And you asked me how we're institutionalizing it in the hub, Dave. And I guess you're one of the people that's leading this. And I very much appreciate the work you've done to create this online resource where people can just flag any concerns. And to me, I'd like to see concerns flagged there that are not necessarily, although they could, but not necessarily pointing at someone who has behaved in an appropriate way, but also just asking, like, how should I behave in this relationship, which I'm feeling uncomfortable with? And that could just be, look, I'm working weekends. I want to succeed in a career. If I don't, my supervisor is going to be cross with me because I won't have been able to produce the analysis by a deadline. How should I feel about that? And I'm sure all of us have experiences, and we can work through that. A last point maybe is around the danger of a culture of mistrust that can always arise from these processes and how we balance that. And I don't think we've resolved that at all, or even necessarily discussed it. But I hope, to go back to the point I've just made, that we can use safeguarding as a way to all reflect on our professional practice. There will be a sort of continuum of, you know, the scales of risk, of harm that people are experiencing, but even minor issues. If there's a way that we can use this online resource to flag them and use them maybe even as kind of like 6 monthly discussion points, then we'll generate a culture that's a supportive one. And yes, there'll be at an extreme things that are, you know, illegal possibly, but I suspect that the majority will be more these kind of self-harm, self-pressurizing moments that we should be able to talk through what's accessible.
Thanks, Mark. Interesting response. I think for me that highlights the importance of safeguarding and how it's addressing the systemic gaps in the scope and the practice of ethical research or research ethics, in that my understanding of a typical research ethics forms doesn't deal with these internal dynamics of power and hierarchy amongst all of the pressures that you described there. And interestingly framing it in terms of self-harm as well. I think that next week we're going to be looking at power dynamics and a framework looking at visible, invisible, and hidden power. So for me, that speaks to an invisible power of the expectations that we feel and what's generating those expectations, internally and externally driven. Also, I really appreciate your emphasis on the culture of how we're working there, because my understanding of all of this is that we need to embed it in the culture of how we practice. And that's not something that we can tangibly put into a set of instructions or procedures or governance. It's about how we all bring ourselves to work and how we work together. So we've run out of time. We had planned a lot more discussions, but this always seems to happen. Luckily, the next 2 webinars that we have, we've kept quite open. So we want to continue to open up the space for conversation. Apologize that we weren't able to answer anyone's questions in the chat, but a promise I'll make is that we're taking these on board and we'll be looking to open these up and discuss them in the next 2 webinars, and then also into the city-based workshops, which everyone will have access to. One challenge I'd like to set everyone before next week's webinar is to have a conversation with another colleague about these issues, about how they apply to your work in particular. So coming back to the first Menti question we had, and there was clearly a difference, although only in the disaggregated form really, between how we view ethics and our responsibility to think about it in our own work versus the hub as a whole. Because ideally, and I'm sure John here will agree, all of our work must be contributing to the hub's mission. So the hub's mission will be the greater than the sum of the parts of our individual work. So these are the moments that form our overall ethical responsibility to reduce disaster risk for tomorrow's cities, for the poor in tomorrow's cities. We're 1 minute over now, so I'd like just to thank very much the speakers for all of your work that's been hidden in the background in helping us to get to this point. Thanks to Mark as well for his contributions, and sorry for putting you on the spot there a little bit. One last thing I'll say, well, 2 last things. Dave has just put a form site link there for feedback on today's webinar. We'll really appreciate your feedback and thoughts here, because I'm very much trying to, as I've said, design this engagement based on your input and how this is this comes up at any point. Another way of engaging to help shape how we do this, because this is going to be the next few months, we're really shaping our approach to safeguarding, is get in touch with me if you'd like to join an informal network or an informal group of people interested in ethics and safeguarding issues that I've already reached out to a few of you in the hub. We've already got 12 or so people. And the idea here is that we just have regular or semi-regular informal conversations discussing issues that have come up. It's also a place for you to register your interest to be a kind of formally identify yourself as an ethics and safeguarding champion, but also specifically for the responsibility of being a focal point. And we'll have to identify key focal points across the whole hub to enable a diversity of pathways for people to report any concerns, for those persons to be able to provide any support, and to help us work through any issues that do get raised in a way that addresses these power dynamics and hierarchies, Mark, that you talked about. And finally, just a reminder that the policy is going to be, well, is on the website, and we're going to tweet it out today. It's a living document. All of your feedback is really valuable. Dave, have I missed anything in the wrapping up of this webinar? I've kind of overstepped into your role a little bit there.
Not at all. Just to add that the registration form for next week's webinar will be circulated tomorrow, along with the video from this webinar. And to thank Dave and all of the speakers again for their contributions.
Great. Thanks, Dave. And thanks, everyone. Looking forward to continuing these discussions.